Hello and welcome to another episode of V's Perspective. In this episode, we'll talk about the status of the G7 and the deliberations that have been going on in the context of G7 meeting that is upcoming in Canada. One of the main issues concerning India is, of course, the invitation extended to the leadership in India and whether and how much of a tension that creates within Canada. What are the factors and where does India stand on this? First is, of course, the fact that amidst rumors that India was not extended an invitation to G7, I think much of that you could say is partly right, partly wrong, because there's been external pressure on by the G6 countries, apart from Canada, on Canada, to be able to ensure that the discussion on and the meeting of G7 is attended by India. There are various reasons for this. Of course, India is the fifth largest economy, and the pull that it has on G7 countries is extraordinary in terms of a global South countries pulling weight at a coalition of global North countries. The second is India is perhaps the only country in the G7 which bridges the global South with the global North, and I think it's an opportunity for the rest of the global South countries to be able to get that representation in the room and ensure that the deliberations thereof, including the uh, the fiscal policies around the world, the financial policies around the world, are constructed in a manner that it bridges the uh, global South, and it aligns with some of the policies that the European Union and other G7 countries are now forced to look at to different directions of the world because of Trump's policies. The third reason is, of course, Trump's policies, the policies from Washington D.C. and the impact that it could have on G7. It has had on G7 and its outlook. It is understood broadly that G7 remains, America remains a country, an outlier, since the Trump administration has taken over in terms of what it wants as a group to do and what it wants individually to do. And clearly, the tariffs that have been imposed since Trump came into office in the second term, has had significant impacts on the outlook of G7 as a group. There are various other factors, for example, how within some of the minilaterals based on other ideas and not just finances, as G7 is. I mean, G7 remains a pure financial grouping, but I think if you look at other priorities of the Western countries, for example, intelligence, and you have the Five Eyes coalition, and some of the countries, some of the membership of G7 overlap there, has had their own tension in the past in terms of what America wants from its own partners, um, both allies, partners, and even friends. So I think all of these tensions are playing out within the G7, with the background that China is, of course, spreading its wings, and the dependencies on all the G7 countries of China is extraordinary. If you look at the past, it's perhaps at its highest, and it is likely to grow because what has happened due to the policies of the United States is that it has created a operational space for China to operate in terms of where it wants to take the uh, the coalition. Finally, I think the politics of G7 is really playing out. I think the invitation extended to India remains. It's very difficult to see how it is being assessed by the Indian leadership. Of course, we've had the Prime Minister tweeting about and um, showing his willingness that he will be able to join and is willing to join the G7 meeting. I think the onus really lies on Canada in terms of any threats emerging from the Canadian soil, from the Khalistanis, um, to disrupt, or any effort to disrupt the G7 proceedings in Canada. The onus for that lies on Canada. Canada has been put on notice by various Khalistani activities, including the SFJ, which is Sikh for Justice, which openly touts for a separate Khalistan. I think all of these should be red flags and signals for Canadians, for the Canadian government to actually prepare for the G7 meeting. And if India is really a part of it, which looks increasingly likely, then the onus of protection, a smooth proceeding, and operation of the G7 meeting really lies in Canada. Finally, I think G7 is increasingly feeling the weight of G20. And I think the G20 economies, of which India was the India hosted the meeting last year in New Delhi, is increasing. Is because of the increasing expanse of economies in the G20, and because of the conflicts that are playing out, G20 has been able to create a wider spectrum of engagement between the global south and global south and global north countries. And I think within that space, G7 is increasingly pressured into a corner of accommodation where it sees important countries, important not just countries, but I think economies like India, really indispensable to the whole agenda of G7. Let me stop there.